I want to thank everybody for showing up today. This is the Senior Center's online lecture and discussion program, Something to Talk About. We meet Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and some other times as well. And we're supported by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island. You can learn more about their memory care, assisted living, and independent living on Rolling Bay by calling 360-689-4314. And I'd like to begin by noting that we are gathering on the ancestral homeland of the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water who have lived and fished on the waters of the Salish Sea since time immemorial. We honor them, we are grateful for their hospitality, and we seek healing with the tribe. This is our final series of discussions about Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. And it's been a very informative and interesting ride for me. I hope that you also have found these conversations thoughtful and stimulating. To remind you of our ground rules, please be curious, listen in order to understand, be respectful, no cross-talking or interrupting, and please share the air. Try to limit your comments to a couple of minutes maximum. I'll be the timekeeper and try to keep us on track and give everybody a chance to express themselves. The community, in addition to what we've done at the Senior Center, the community as a whole has had a number of activities, including a finale with a streamed presentation by Jason Reynolds, the author, along with Ibram Kendi, he was speaking at Seattle Arts and Lectures. What I'm hoping to do today in our final meeting is to focus on what we can take away from this whole BI Reads for Justice program. Some folks have expressed some criticism of the book, and one of them, Brian, who's on, sent me a 25-page critique. If you'd like to read it, I would be happy to send it to you. Just send an email to info@biseniorcenter.org, and I will forward it to you. Today, rather than debating the book itself, I'd like to focus on the larger issue of our cultural heritage regarding race, what we've learned, and how, as Layla Saad, the British author of Me and White Supremacy, has remarked, how we can become good ancestors to future generations. What can we do to be with in a mood of welcoming and inclusivity? It's said that winners write history, and I think that we've learned through the course of this series of conversations that history looks very different to different people. What kinds of different histories do we have in this country? Let's talk a little bit about what we've observed about those kinds of different perspectives, and how can we honestly work to reflect those various perspectives. So if you have a comment about that, I'd love to hear it now. You can raise your hand or put something in the chat. What's your thought about the various histories that we might have in this country? Different perspectives on what makes America, what has made the United States of America. I feel like one of the things that I have definitely seen is that depending on where you grew up or what kinds of experiences you had growing up, your understanding of what it looks like in this country is dramatically different. Obviously, we heard from people like Jason Reynolds, who was saying that to him there's a real awareness that race is a cogent part of life, and that when you are viewed by other people, your color, your skin tone, your accents are things that are immediately noticed. I don't know how many of you read Isabel Wilkerson's book, Cast, but she opens the book reflecting on being the owner of an old house. This is something that D. Eisenhower, the pastor over at Eagle Harbor Church, was mentioning this weekend, and it just jumped out at me. I'm going to quote from Wilkerson now. The house that she was living in had been built generations ago, and she noticed the slightest welt in a corner of plaster in a spare bedroom, and she chalked it up to idiosyncrasy. But over time, the welt in the ceiling became a wave that widened and bulged despite a new roof. She called in an inspector who used an infrared lens to search out what was behind the misshapen bow in the ceiling, trying to see what the eye could not see. Wilkerson writes, when you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you're ignoring will not go away. Whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look at it or not. Whatever you are wishing away will gnaw at you until you gather the courage to face what you would rather not see. Wilkerson compares America to an old house. We didn't build it, but we live in it. We are heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. She says the caste system that was very much out in the open in the era of slavery and conquest is still affecting us, but it's hidden behind some new drywall and fresh coats of paint. The good news is that we who inherited this house have other options besides slapping another coat of whitewash on an underlying structural problem. Anti-racism work does what the inspector in Wilkerson's house did. It looked behind the surface with tools designed to diagnose the dry rot, leaky roofs, and so forth. Any reaction to that? Brian, you have your hand up.
I'm sorry, Reed, it wasn't specifically to that passage, but just as far as I think it's important to hear the different perspectives from different people. We all have our own very limited perspective, and it's wonderful to see things through others' eyes and others' experiences. And certainly there are differences amongst people of different races in general. I also think it's important to give weight to the perspective of historians when we're talking about our history, because they've studied this. And I think that through their work, they can provide a more objective view of history as it's aggregated from different stories and different people. And I also think that there is some value in us having some common understanding in our country of what our history is, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, because we all have a common future to a degree. We are all in this country, and we need to decide how we're going to change things to move forward.
Thank you.
We have a common destiny.
Yeah, I think that that there is that aspect of the winners write history. I think that one of the things we've seen in recent years is that there are histories that were not being told that are now being told. That for reasons of discomfort might have been something some of us did not want to go into the basement to see if there was rain collecting. Anyone else?
Reed, this is Joe McMillan here in the room. I'm off camera because we're so crowded in, but I am someone who has taught history for over a decade at both the college level and for a year in a private high school during the 80s and the 90s prior to moving on to practice law. So, I've been a student of history. I have a graduate degree in history, and I've read history all my life.
So Joe, what do you think about this idea of a variety of different perspectives on history?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to speak to, Reed. I think it's an excellent point. And, I was going to point out that the sort of critique of American history, what's generally referred to as historiography, which is sort of the study of how history is presented. That critique was really advanced during my tenure as a young student in like the 70s and the early 80s. What we heard was a very strong critique, and it grew out of the activism of the 60s and the 70s, which helped focus on some of these alternative perspectives that Reed has very appropriately sort of called attention to, which are voices that need to be heard. And so, as I was studying history at the university, there was a very pronounced emphasis on those who were not the winners, whose voices had not been included in, you know, what was called sort of the progressive version of American history that embraced the notion of American exceptionalism, that we're a nation, you know, kind of the caricature of us being a nation that advanced boldly across a frontier and are champions of freedom, democracy, and liberty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I mean, this critique, which you know, I think Reed is alluding to by calling out the need for alternative voices to be heard. This critique is not new. I mean, it really dates from that era in the late 20th century, the 70s, particularly when social history, it came to the forefront in history departments around the country at universities, where I was a graduate student reading this stuff. So it was a valuable critique.
Okay, valuable critique. Thank you. I want to make sure.
But I guess my main point, Reed, is that while it's important, as Brian said, to hear those different perspectives, there is still a kind of a thread of sort of basic political history that, you know, that is from the old school. Now, you can strip away some of the triumphalist attitudes around it, and which deserve critique, but it shouldn't be thrown out entirely, right? You can't, I mean, you still need respect for basic facts, all right? So even if someone advancing, you know, like I'm a voice that hasn't been heard before, and I want to say that the American Revolution was fought in order to preserve slavery in the United States. That's just a mistaken view of history that is unsupported by the facts, by, as Brian alluded to, the professional scholars who have grappled with the documents and the intellectual history of that era and who are intimately familiar with it. And they would just say, well, I understand, you know, the good intentions of hearing other voices, but we must really maintain, while we welcome that, we still need a respect for basic facts.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there, Joe, but thank you very much for that well-articulated point of view. Anybody else have a thought about some of those perspectives that Joe might be calling false? That we have heard in some of these. Oh, okay. Robert, go ahead.
This is Barbara Golden. I like to respond to the first thing you said about America. I think we have a history of subjugation, violence, and forced assimilation that we need to deal with. If we don't want to go forward with those things, we have to deal with them now.
Yeah, I think that's something to the degree of what we were hearing from Isabel Wilkerson about the idea that if these stories, this history is not shared, it's going to fester. And I think to some degree that's what we've seen in our culture in the last 30 to 40 years, is that there are unaddressed issues issues that weren't taught in schools, that weren't part of the accepted history, or at least the taught history, which are now beginning to be told more clearly.
I think
Eve, I think, is that right?
Yes, it is me. And Anne asked me to come down here to act as something of a moderator, to take some of the burden off of you. Rather than trying to, level off what it is, and my understanding is this is the last session of this group.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct. We've had 5 where we dealt with specific parts of the book. And today we're looking at takeaways and sort of things that we've learned through the whole BI Reads for Justice series. That's so, not only happened here.
Yeah, no, I understand it's not only here. But, my purpose in coming down here today was to try to get a sense of what people have learned from this book. Mm-hmm. And I would really like it if rather than reacting to one thing or another, which can, bring out different, needs to justify this or that, or to make sure that we understand how bad this is or whatever, that I would really like it if we just went around and I want people to tell me what it is that they think I need to know that they've learned from this book.
Okay, do you want to start us off, Eve?
I haven't read the book. I have no idea. You are talking to someone who told Ann, I haven't read the book. All right? So
Okay.
I'm really curious as to what people think that I, who haven't read the book, should know about this book.
Okay, is there anybody else in the room with Eve?
We got lots of people in the room.
We got lots.
Katie.
Well, I'm so glad you're here. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about the book is that, as you may have picked up, it's about American history and the experience of a different voice, like Reed was saying. But the first thing it says is this is not a history book. And so I think that that's an interesting perspective, and from listening to what the writer spoke about when we were listening to him, it seemed to me like there's just an incredible amount of people in America that haven't been heard, and that their story and their perspective hasn't been shared. And so I felt like I really appreciated in the book this analysis kind of how power will, cause you to either assimilate or, separate. Or the question is, how do we be anti-assimilation and separation, and be anti-racist and find a new way? So that's what I loved about the book.
Great. Who wants to go next?
I can go next. This is Patty. I don't know. I guess you can see me in the screen.
Yep.
So I have been to a number of these gatherings, but not at the senior center, at the library, and at the museum, and not the museum, at the at the movie theater, and at the bookstore and so on. And I finished the book except for the notes in the back, basically. And there's a couple of things that I want to say about the book. This book was written sort of on the level of a middle school or high school in terms of a fun thing, an easy book to read. And it was very easy for me to read because of that. I didn't have to do postgraduate study of it. And then one of the things, there are two different things that I think of in terms of this book. I was really impressed by Jason Reynolds' presentation at the Arts and Lecture the other week. And the first thing I think we need to think about is that we really need to work on building a community where all of us can work together and communicate with one another. And it's something that Martin Luther King was really pushing, which was the beloved community. And it was even brought up by Gandhi way back in the 40s, I think. And so we have to find ways where we can work together and understand one another and communicate with one another. And I think that's, I get that impression from what Jason Reynolds was saying as well. And I think that's very, very important. And then the other piece, which I'm still grappling with and trying to understand, has to do with reparations. And specifically what I mean about reparations is the violence that took place for a number of groups of people of color in this country has made it such that, especially with African Americans, that they have not been able to build the amount of money in their families like my family has. My family came over in 1632 and ended up in Boston. Okay, it's a Lyman family. You can look it up. We've been around for a really long time, but we've had a long time to build our family up. And I suspect that hundreds of linemen in the United States are doing very well. I think Richard Lyman was the head of one of the colleges in California once. And I have that privilege because, my father was a doctor, and he was able to put some money away, and I also had the opportunity to get a pension and Social Security, and I'm doing well in my life. But there are lots and lots of people that don't have that opportunity, even if they are already defined as upper middle class or middle class. They don't have all the extra resources that came through my family for 300 years. And so I think that's something that we all have to think about. What's the best way to deal with that? I'm not necessarily saying I want to sell my house to the Suquamish tribe, for example. I mean, I suspect that my house, the land that I was on, was originally owned by a Japanese family, but I think before that it might have been a place where the Suquamish tribe was fishing, maybe. And there's a lot of issues there that would be worthwhile to work on. I appreciate places like, just an example, in outside of Chicago, Evanston, Illinois has been as a town trying to deal with reparations in that town. And there are different, and then I guess San Francisco was just looking at an interesting thing about that as well.
Okay, Patty, I'm gonna interrupt just so that everybody gets a chance to pop in, but thank you very much for your perspective. B?
Yes, well, good that you can see me from that little screen there. My name is B. Dixon, and as you can hear from my accent, I immigrated to this country about 45 years ago. So I'm definitely American now, naturalized and the whole thing. But I do want to, but it's not a but. I really want to share also with you that me coming to America was a wonderful experience for me. I was really looking forward to being here. It is true that America was, in a way, laid the foundation for democracy, that it was like an aspiration, a dream, the Declaration of Independence, the rights and everything, I mean, and me feeling like I was joining that was extraordinarily pleasurable. I really enjoyed that very much. At first I was kind of into it at all. And then gradually I had to kind of also hold that and say, yes, I'm here. I'm so happy to be here. And I also realized that there are some issues here that have been longstanding. And I was listening recently, I captured a little excerpt of an interview that this comedian Kimmel was doing with Bono, and you might have seen it. And Kimmel was asking Bono, what do you think about America? And he said, America is a song that hasn't yet been sung fully, meaning it laid the foundation, wonderful foundation of democracy and everything that I so benefited from myself. But there's still more work to be done. And I appreciate the work of Ibram Kendi. I appreciate, that book that is now being distributed to students. But we need to do more work with that. You can't just put that book out there and say, okay, middle schooler, here, you read that. What do we adults do with that? What do parents do with that? Can we join those students to process everything that went on and then create a new song? How we're going to do that, I don't know. But I don't want to let go of that kind of enthusiasm that I continue to feel for the country that has given me so much, really. I'm always very touched by that. So anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, B. Anybody in the hallway?
Yeah.
I think you have to step forward.
Okay. I'm Marianne Wiley, and I did read the book quite a while ago.
Marianne, could you come
Yeah, come into the room.
Okay.
for a second?
What this whole movement that this book is one part of has done for me is give me more a sense of how to build community with people that I didn't normally have community with, even though I worked in a racial community health clinic in Seattle. Here on Bainbridge, it's not the same. And this has brought me out into the greater Kitsap community, where I just went to an event this past week, Rising Up from Slavery Summit, which was about taking action as a community. And the phrase I came away with is community is proximity. So the more we can get proximity to diversity, the better we're going to build that community, is my experience from my work in Seattle at Rainier Beach and from what I've been learning here in this county.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Martha, your microphone is off. Did you have something you wanted to add?
No,
No,
I'm
not-
just listening.
Okay.
Thank you, Bill.
Hi, can you hear me okay? I'm
Yeah,
just gonna
who's,
stand up.
who's, spe-
Yeah,
who's
sorry
speaking
about-
now?
My name is Alex. I'll start. I got to read Brian's paper. I think it is excellent. I recommend it to everybody to get a copy and read it. What I appreciated about it, and Brian, I think I've told you this, is just your commitment to historical fact. And it sounds like maybe I'm being critical. I am. I think critical of this book from the perspective of a parent whose kids are in school. And I think a lot about my kids' experience in school. And, my dad always says, you don't want to hide your kids from uncomfortable and inconvenient and, things that are not fun. And, but there's just, Brian really breaks it down here really well. His paper is titled Misrepresentations of History and Stamps. And I can't help but think about what we are teaching our kids. It's not about just alternative perspectives. I think, as Joe said, there's some grounding in fact that needs to happen. Brian's introduction here, Kendi Reynolds give a single reason for American
rather
colonists.
than talking about what Brian said, you're talking to me and telling me what I should get out of this book.
Sure.
No. What
Yeah.
I really want is you to put that away.
Yeah.
Eve, let him say what he wants to say. But he tried to police his comment.
But we don't
But
have that
we're
much.
not talking about Brian's thing. We're talking about stamped. And
Yeah.
the question here is not
Yeah.
what do you think that you learned from Brian, but what did you
I read
learn
the
from
book.
stamped?
I read the book,
Yeah.
and these are my takeaways as well.
And we're trying to make sure we have time for everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, and as I said at the beginning, just so that everybody's clear, I'm
And I
happy.
ain't rude on this, but this is what my job was.
Excuse
Yeah.
me, Eve.
Mhm.
Eve.
Yes.
Okay, I just want people to know that if they would like to hear or read Brian's perspective, he did share it with me, and I'm happy to send it to anybody who would like to get it. It's a PDF, info@biseniorcenter.org, and I'll send the 25-page document to you. Is there anybody else who'd like to answer either Eve's question about what would be the takeaway for Eve from this book, she having not read it?
What would be the takeaway?
What would you think I need to know from this book?
She hasn't read it.
I haven't read it.
Oh, you haven't read the book?
I have not. I'm here because Ann told me to come here. She said, you moderate it, keep them on task, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, I haven't read the book fully. I have read kind of the beginning, maybe a quarter of the way.
Okay.
So I don't know if I have that much opinion yet. Although I know it's I think every group that gets together and commonly gets together has a different opinion possibly than the next group that gets together more commonly, and this guy is representing a certain group that gets together all the time, I imagine. And so he has that opinion. So I don't, I like to read about his opinion, but I don't know if I have the same opinion. I haven't really formed it yet.
Okay, thank you.
I have another question that we can go to. Racism has changed over the course of American history, the way that it has presented itself. And so I'm wondering, what are the challenges of racism today that might be different than 60 years ago? Any thoughts about where we are today in the response to racism based on your own life experience and what you might have taken away from the study this past couple months.
It's up to you, Nick.
Yeah.
Answer whatever.
So it's a different question.
You can answer any of the questions you want.
Okay.
There are enough questions out here.
All right. Well, I read the original book.
Can you start just by identifying yourself? Thanks.
My name is Amy Aspel. I've lived 18 years now. And I believe I was raised in a racist family, although it didn't come up all that often because we weren't really in the middle of much diversity at that time. And but so I guess I say that because I think that probably a lot of us were raised in a situation like that, but I can't remember ever feeling that way myself. But maybe a little awkward around people who are different, or not knowing, not as much at ease as when you're with somebody you've been palling around with for 10 years. So this book, it's much easier to read than the Kendi book that is really long. I read that whole book and very impressed by all of the information he was able to collect and put together there, and to go back like hundreds of years about attitudes about race. I guess my biggest concern now is, how do we get beyond that, And it does seem to me it's by contact that we need to interact, and that our country still isn't very much, at least here on Bainbridge Island, it's not set up very much that way. Although we get a different mix, It's not black and white so much as like some Asian and Indian, and we get more of that here. And I think there's like an easier interaction, sometimes at least. And so, my biggest interest is, how can we persuade people to like all other people, and not just some narrow swath?
Thank you.
I thank you. I think that there's an interesting. I don't know how many of you have seen the Broadway show Avenue Q. It was done by our own BPA a few years ago. There's a song in that show called "Everyone's a Little Bit Racist," and part of the lyric goes, "I think everyone's a little bit racist sometimes. Doesn't mean we go around committing hate crimes, but look around and you will find no one's really colorblind." Mm-hmm. So I think that there's an aspect of that we are aware and should not pretend that we're not aware of our differences, and we should actually be respectful of the fact that our differences are different, that we have different attitudes, that something that might offend me would not offend you. Mm-hmm. And the like. I wonder if anybody on the call here, besides in the room, although I'm very happy the room is so active. It turns out this is the biggest turnout we've had in person all week, or all 2 months, and it's the smallest room we have available. So anybody else on the call would like to pop up? Kimmy.
Yeah, I live in a society where I see disparities everywhere. And if you want to go back to the data, as other people suggest, that's the only place we would look for answers, I have to ask the question of why, I'm not know how accurate, but I think I'm pretty close. Like 40% of, jail inmates are of color, and yet they only represent like less than 20%. Why are health outcomes for Black women in King County so much worse than white women? why are there such achievement gaps in schools between different groups of people? And it comes down to our historical roots and what I think our government has systematically done undercover by law, allowed things to discriminate against people of color that have created these disparate outcomes. I think we all know about redlining, and someone alluded to wealth and equity. What we have as people is so much greater than Black people. And why is that? It's because of the systematic legal acts committed against people of color. And so unless we understand the historical roots for this, why was a Civil War fought, and yet the South was able to continue enacting, Jim Crow laws? All of these things have historical roots to them. And so we are at the present time, and if we don't have an answer to the question why there are more Black people in jail than they represent in terms of the population, then you're telling me that they are inherently evil people, right? They're breaking more laws. Well, I refuse to believe that. And so unless we understand how these disparities came along in the whole course of our American history, and then find out, it happened before even America was created, that it was very advantageous to capture weak people and make money off them. And if you look at our systems today, isn't that what's happening? So I don't think it's a matter of, oh, well, this fact is this, because history is not set in stone. If you're religious and you believe the tablets, those might be set in stone. But as far as the interpretation of how we got here to the present is up for discussion, because I had no idea that people didn't know about the incarceration of my family at Tule Lake. It was never taught to me. It should have hit me. But when I went to college, I talked to people, they had never heard of it. Was that part of our history that people could choose to exclude? Well, it was significant to me. And when this island, when I first moved here 11 years ago, and they spent every Memorial Day of exclusion because they were the first people to go, I never felt more included and more welcomed as a Japanese person. And so that's the charge we have as citizens of this island and of this community and of this country, to make sure every American person here feels that same joy and feeling of inclusion, because their history, their stories have not been excluded as part of the larger understanding of what America is.
Thank you for that, Kimmy.
Yeah.
And I think your personal experience as a Japanese American helps bring to light the kind of thing that we're talking about in terms of different stories. So I appreciate you sharing that. Jane.
Yeah, thank you, Kimmy. It goes to my thought about why somebody should read this book is the same as, for me, it's hearing the voices of lived experience. It's like reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, Toni Morrison, some of the people that have talked, like Kimmy and I think Lena, about their own experiences. that brings it home. That makes it real. That makes it emotional. There's an emotional connection to what somebody whose life experience is different from mine, I can understand it better. And that to me is the value of reading a book like this. Dr. Kendi does amazing work in presenting this information, and just kind of learning through hearing other people's voices of their lived experience, I think is value.
Thank you.
Read, this is Barbara Golden again.
Oh, good. Hi, Barbara.
And
Yeah.
hi, I just like to tell a story that I was told by a person who was a white woman who was a friend of mine. And she says she came from a liberal family. And she said that they always collected clothes for those poor people and people of color, and marched and did everything. But she was never taught how to deal with her peer group who was not white. And I think that's one of the things we're talking about here, how people deal with peer groups. And there's a book that I was looking for. I couldn't find it on my shelf, but it's called Other People's Children. And I heard the woman, the author of that book, speak. And she said those who benefit from certain rules are the least likely to talk about what they are. And what I found from my family, because I know white people in my family and Black people in my family, they don't, not everybody understands how this country works the same way. And that goes back to people saying, the last woman who was talking about lived experience. We all have a different lived experience, and community is about communication. Because if we are taught that you collect canned goods for every Black person you don't know how to deal with the person who sits next to you in school or at work, who doesn't want your old clothes and doesn't want your canned goods. And that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of what we heard from Amy earlier about the idea that we need to have experiences of hearing each other's stories. We need to be familiar enough with people and not afraid. That my little quote about we're all a little bit racist is we need to excuse ourselves from maybe being afraid that we might say the wrong thing, and be willing to say the wrong thing in order to learn the right thing, which takes a little courage, especially if you aren't sure what the first step is. And you may not, I mean, I know I am not. Growing up, I was totally unaware of the privilege that I had as a white male. I just expected that when I raised my hand, I would be called on, and that when I said something, people would listen, and that I would be smart. I know Kimmy's covering her ears. I don't know if, that kind of experience of privilege, of recognizing your own privilege. Anybody like to share a little bit about how that might have been something you discovered, your privilege or your lack of privilege? Barbara, Coda. There's more than one Barbara here, okay? Please unmute.
So I kept thinking about the progress and then this awful undertow of racism that would undo it, so thinking starting around the Civil Rights Act and how significant that was, and the Voting Rights Act. And then look at where we are now. I mean, those were huge advances. And we've lost so much ground since then. I think about the war on drugs, which really focused primarily on the Black community and Black men in particular, versus where we're at now socially when we talk about the opioid epidemic. And the people who are suffering from that now receive sympathy, and the society wants to help them, which I think is an appropriate response. It would have been an appropriate response in the past. And so just thinking about the back and the forth and the undertow, and at the end of the book, and so many books I've read recently, I just feel like how exhausting it must be to be a person of color and get up every day in this country and go out in the world. And who knows what kind of stuff you're going to have to deal with, intentional or not, and just how wearying that must be. That's really all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you for saying that. Pamela, you'll need to unmute.
Hi, Pamela Walker. I'm just, this is my first meeting with this group, and I haven't read the full book. I actually got the full book, which is a 17-hour listen. So it's quite involved, but I heard that this book is being read by our middle schoolers. Is that correct?
I believe that it is one of the books that is available to middle schoolers, and maybe some teachers are using it. I don't know that it's
In the curriculum in middle school.
It's actually required. Is that right, Alex?
Reading for middle schoolers in the curriculum.
Okay. You know, whether it's perfectly written or not, I think I grew up in a very similar situation as suburbs in California, as Bainbridge Island, and I didn't have very little exposure to people of different colors. And so I think the more literature out there, the better for kids of any kind, certainly Native American literature, literature about people of color, different countries, everything. I mean, the more we can bring into those kids, the better. And we should be starting at kindergarten, you know, in my opinion, just to make it normalize it, normalize communication between people of all places and colors and everything, male, female, everything, genders, all genders. So that's what I think. And the more, the better.
Thank you, Pamela. Any other comments? What was you were going to do here? Facilitation, Eve, you'd like to throw in? You'll need to unmute.
Lena's got a hand up, I think.
Okay, Lena, thank you. Go ahead, unmute, Lena. You'll need to.
Okay, hi, thank you, Eve. Just to kind of respond to Pamela's comment about the education piece and teaching our young ones the real history of so many, through the lenses of so many people. The banning of so many books in many of our states that is happening right before our eyes right now is really concerning to me, thinking about my nieces and nephews that are in the school systems. And if that kind of thought process and laws are going to come our direction and happen more, it's kind of scary. But also really more locally too. You guys may have seen it, you know, in publication on Facebook and things like that about the renaming of schools here on the island and how there's some pushback on that as to why we're renaming the schools. For example, I'm going to throw it out there because it's out there publicly. Wilkes Elementary School is up for renaming, and there's a lot of pushback as to the options that the community can choose from that. Suimatsu, Mr. Suimatsu is one of the options. One of the Suquamish names is another option, and so forth. But the education piece, I just, Pamela, really, that struck my heart when you mentioned that, because I just feel that it's under attack right now, and becoming more so, and here locally especially too, with just the renaming of the school was a big thing. And so I just wanted to add my view on your comment. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Lena.
All right, do I need to hit this?
It's on mute. You're fine. You gotta speak.
I can speak. I don't know how long we have for this. I do know that Ann told me that some people are going to talk about what actions can be taken, locally. And, I also see that Brian's got his hand up. But, that's what I know of, Reed.
Okay, yeah, we do want to close here in about 5 minutes with some suggestions about ways that you might be able to follow up with this, what things you might think about doing coming forth from this BI Reads for Justice. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I got 2 points. I want to go back to the comment that somebody made earlier and in the previous meeting as well. When in the book, Kendi Reynolds say, this isn't a history book. What I took away from that, and I think I've heard them say this in an interview, Kendi Reynolds, is what they mean by that is it's a book which explains the world the way it is today. But the book does make historical claims. And I think, it's not a novel, it's not fiction. And those historical claims can be evaluated as far as their accuracy with historical facts or not. But as far as going forward, I wanted to bring up, expand it a little bit. I wasn't thinking so much about what we would do locally, but one of the things that Kendi says in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is that we should be advocating for policies that produce racial equity. And I'm thinking of 3 things. I don't know how many of you are familiar with John McWhorter. He's been writing about race for decades. He's a New York Times columnist. And in his most recent book, he has 3 suggestions that he thinks would help Black Americans most of all. One is to make sure that kids who don't come from what he calls book-lined homes are taught to read using phonics. Studies have shown that works better for kids and the other is advocate for vocational training. Not everybody needs to go to college. Maybe we should be making trade schools free ahead of making four-year universities free. And the other would be ending the war on drugs, which I'm not really sure where the status of that is now. To these, I would add advocate for universal health care in this country and advocate for policies that will reduce the gap between rich and poor in this country, because those policies will disproportionately help Black people in this country.
Thank you.
Reed, this is Joe McMillan. I might just point out, John McWhorter is actually a linguist and a professor, I believe, at Columbia University, if I'm not mistaken, in New York. He's an African-American, and I think Brian's suggestion that people take a look at some of his proposals for how to move forward from where we're at are really worthwhile. Glenn Lowry is another African-American scholar from Brown University who writes on race issues with a lot of insight, I think. And again, I think focusing on the economic injustices is, as Brian suggests, the way to go. I personally feel sometimes the race issue is used by, by corporate interests to throw dust into the gears of trying to promote a greater, sort of class-based analysis that would benefit everybody in this country. So an economic focus would, as somebody said, I think Brian said, have the actual effect of benefiting communities of color tremendously, and it wouldn't sort of focus on divisive, racialized issues.
Okay, thank you both of you. Yes, Kimi.
I think just economics is racialized. I mean, economics doesn't just happen in a vacuum. So I totally agree. I totally agree that we would all benefit from healthcare and, you know, focusing more on fixing the economic problem. But that's where the rub is. And I also asked the question about why Brian wants to focus on phonics and vocational vocational
Ed.
and war on drugs as a solution to the racial problem. Is it because you think that's where the problem is with these, with the, is it?
I was bringing up, those are suggestions that John McWhorter, who's been studying issues for a long time, in his book, that he thinks would help African Americans in this country quite a bit.
Okay, I'm a reading specialist, so phonics is an absolute essential skill, and so, but I wouldn't pull phonics over comprehension or any other phonemic awareness or you know, orthographic work. I mean, I don't get the focus on the phonics, I guess, as a solution to a racial issue.
I think he's looking at it at ways that can help young African American children learn to read better.
Well, I think reading is an essential skill in this culture for sure, for everybody. So no objection at all on the idea of that, I think, from anybody here. One of the things that that Amy raised was the idea of having more direct experience with people from different cultures, different backgrounds. Any thoughts about how we might be able to do that ourselves? I don't think this is, I mean, one of the things I've discovered in having these discussions is that this is not a entirely white community, and there are African Americans who live here. We just don't maybe think of ourselves as diverse a place as we might be surprised to find. So there are ways that we can reach out, get involved with communities that we might not otherwise have seen. Yes, somebody in the conference room? No, just, that was just a noise. Okay.
If I can say one thing before things close up here,
That'd be great.
I just want to apologize that I was rude before. And, you know, that I'm just trying to do what I was assigned to do. And I really appreciate that people are talking about this. It's really unusual that, you know, what I would say is what, 2 years, 3 years now after the last racial reckoning experience, where, you know, every Black person was being interviewed on radio. And I was amazed when I heard those interviews that more than half the time when they were interviewing someone Black about, you know, what it's like to be Black in America, that Black person would say, you gotta, you know, don't get this wrong. I like being Black. I wouldn't change it for the world. And that we define being Black in these discussions as being a problem. And that Black people don't think that they are the problem. You know, that they are a problem, that, you know, we need to recognize that we're not including all of them, and we're just defining them by their problems, by reading, by drugs, by, you know, incarceration or whatever. And the more we define them by these things, the more that, you know, we will make sure those things happen.
I want to thank everybody who took the time to read the book, to participate in these discussions. I don't think that it's been always comfortable, which I think is really a sign that it's been valuable. So thank you all. And I look forward to having further discussions with you in the future.